Good evening and welcome to Conversations on Showing Up for Kids. My name's Tim Markle. I'm director of the Southern Regional Center for Children and Youth with Special Health Care Needs. We partner with 14 counties with families who have children with special health care needs and disabilities, the champions that serve them to try to connect everybody to resources, information, and behind the scenes, we work to try to change the system for the better. I am so excited tonight. This is part of our Autism Acceptance Month combined with Governor Tony Evers declaring 2023 to be the year of mental health. And so we wanted to take April and we wanted to focus a little bit on mental health. And one of the people that I really appreciate learning from is Scott Allen. Scott is a therapist. He's on the board of directors with me with the Autism Society of South Central Wisconsin. He's a friend, he's a colleague. I just like him. So therefore he gets to be on Conversations Aren't Showing Up for Kids. So Scott, I am so glad that you are here tonight. I am really excited.
And I'm glad to be here, and same to you on all fronts. So
all right. And I think tonight we're going to have a short presentation, and then we're going to have some discussion afterwards. So hang tight. And Scott, I turn it over to you. You should be able to share your screen.
All right, I will do that. So thank you, everybody. I will get my presentation up here in just a moment and try to confirm that you can all see this in presentation mode. There we go.
Perfect.
So let me begin by saying that although my specialty as a counselor on the autism spectrum myself, is fellow adults on the autism spectrum. So most of my experience comes from that domain. But I will also say, in terms of this question of dignity, internalized shame, related concepts for autistic people, these are beliefs and impressions and psychological processes that begin in childhood. So childhood is a very important formative time for the development of beliefs about oneself and society and how other people treat you and how you think you deserve to be treated. All these kinds of things take root during childhood. And so that makes it an especially important time to deliver those kinds of narratives and to be able to have people around you have some wisdom to share with you as you are trying to navigate a world that is not really set up with you in mind. So I will get into some thoughts here tonight that I've been developing in response to my work with clients in general and to my own needs and experiences. What do I think is important about dignity? How have I been able to successfully get respect from other people, or be able to present myself in a respectable manner? And it does go in both directions, as I will touch on later in my presentation. So let's start with some general definitions. And I think the easier one to start with, in my case, is this question of internalized shame. So what is it? In general terms, it is a sense of shame that a person has adopted or absorbed into who or what they believe they are. Internalized shame says, I am a problem, rather than I am experiencing a problem. And that's really important because while ordinary shame can generally be resolved through self-reflection, apologizing to others, working on improving one's own standards or making up for what you did, internalized shame doesn't work that way because the person believes it to be a permanent stain or a personality trait on their part, and that it therefore cannot be resolved except by rejecting or moving past it, which is difficult to do once it has become ingrained, and is something that I then, as a counselor, work to help people overcome. For autistic people, internalized shame most often results from chronic external shame, from stigma, from rejection, from the inability to meet the expectations of others, whether reasonable or unreasonable expectations. Sometimes not living up to personal standards can also lead to internalized shame, and that is significant, but it's less common. Overall, internalized standards that have been adopted from a non-autistic society have a strong tendency to create, reinforce, and or worsen internalized shame for autistic people, because these standards don't necessarily work for an autistic person, but they still appear to be true. Those external standards make the internal shame appear real and therefore justified. And oftentimes, even if they're not justified and the person knows that, they still have this sense of, well, I'm never going to be able to live up to the kind of life that I want. And that is often the next step in their own journey through dealing with that internal shame. In particularly intense cases, which are not uncommon in my experience, the person has no sense of valuing their own life or self at all, because they're only referring to external standards that they can't meet. They don't have internal standards of their own that would allow them to have a sense of being okay with themselves. Only the standards of other people, family members, society at large, or whatever it might be, matter to them. And therefore, since they're not living up to those standards, there's an impasse, there's an irresolvable difficulty. Now, dignity has been used in many different ways. It's kind of a blurry word. So I've attempted to narrow it down into a concept that I think may be more useful for general purposes, but especially for my work with autistic people. And from my perspective, since words like honor, esteem, I'm sure pride, any number of others, all of these more or less refer to worth as defined by people other than oneself. So it seems useful to me to define dignity as worth that comes from the self, in order to not have redundancy with these other words. So if we say honor and esteem are what other people give you, then dignity is what you give yourself. I will also note that I'm coming from a perspective of worth, value, preference, approval. All these things are basically the same, and all of them are entirely subjective. Whether something does or does not have value or is worth something to you depends entirely on the person, on the perspective. There's no such thing as a valuometer to decide, oh, this has exactly this much value. It's always going to depend on your purposes or what you want from it, or how much you like it, or those kinds of things, rather than any objective standard. So I've identified from my work that there's this basic distinction between subjective valuing of yourself by others and subjective valuing of you by you, which, by that standard, I would say a dignified person would therefore tend to behave in ways consistent with valuing their own self. So in my mind, and this would look different in different cultural contexts, but in general, a dignified person would tend not to needlessly harm their self or their reputation. They would tend not to be fawning or needy or defensive. And they would tend not to agree to any action standards or beliefs that diminish their own internal subjective sense of self-value. Certainly, sometimes we might need to compromise with other people in the course of navigating society, but in general, these would be standards that a dignified person would uphold. Now, there are going to be some limits to that, and those might include, for example, under this definition, dignified behavior is not what other people consider to be dignified. Whether somebody else thinks you have dignity or not is irrelevant to the question of whether you experience it. So as an external behavior, we would say dignified actions are that which reliably demonstrates that a person values their own self. Like if a person does feel dignity in themselves, they tend to act a certain way. What kinds of ways would most reliably indicate that they are experiencing some kind of dignity? Not that you couldn't fake it or pretend that you have dignity, but in general, we would ask, okay, what is consistent with this kind of personal value system? Also, valuing one's own self does not mean unreasonably or unfairly inflating your own sense of importance. We're not talking about arrogance or overconfidence or other conceits. We're simply talking about, do you like and value you and your own existence in some way? And also, it does not mean not valuing other people. It's not self-absorbed. It doesn't mean denying that other people can or should value themselves or that you can value them. None of that is questioned or in conflict with having dignity for oneself. Whether you value your own life is between you and the universe. It is not between you and anyone else. This is a major point that I make with many of my clients, that for me personally, at least, I say my first relationship is between me and the universe. I'm trying to understand who and what I am in this particular existence. And relationships with other people, although still important for all kinds of practical, emotional, social, and other reasons, all of that is a close second to my understanding of myself and my life in and of itself. And based on this idea, I also tell clients that if you have at least one small ember of dignity, if you have one spark of value for yourself, that you feel that you can value your own life or be okay with some part of yourself, then you can grow that. You can use that to kindle other ways of valuing yourself, however you see fit, whatever that might mean. So as long as you can begin to have that one ember instead of nothing, like some intense cases do, you have something to work with. So to further detail these ideas, this concept of dignity being from the self for the self, I can put that in terms of I am trying to grow, gain, increase, improve, explore, expand, revise, and refine myself and my life for my own sake, first and foremost, not for other people. Not that I can't do it for other people, but that's, again, secondary to, it's intertwined with at best. It's not definitional of what I'm doing for myself. And other people, therefore, they're still part of my life, but only when they need to be, that I can't avoid it, or when I choose to be, because for them to be, rather, so that I'm the one deciding what kind of value, connection, how much I'm giving of myself, all that kind of stuff, not out of a sense of guilt, obligation, other social pressures. Obviously, we all have some social pressures in our lives, but at least internally, I have my own reasoning and my own system for deciding what I do or don't want. And to that point, if I feel an obligation is reasonable and doable, I will uphold it. But I set the standard of what is a respectable obligation for my purposes, not other people. And, that's a blurry line. It's not always perfectly understandable. So I am open to negotiating and updating my standards as long as I'm treated fairly and can sustain a particular standard. So then we have this bigger question, this overarching advocacy-oriented question of the dilemma of dignity, and how do we navigate or negotiate between what we experience in ourselves and how other people experience us, or what we need from them. And there's hundreds and hundreds of things could be said about this. So this is just a basic rundown from my perspective. But the crux of the problem is that gaining respect from other people has to be persuasive, not coercive, because all people have freedom of conscience. They have the right to decide their own moral values, and they have freedom of association, which is the right to decide who they spend time with and how, again, with caveats and within reason. And I would say everyone arguably deserves some basic human respect. I just think society needs that to function. But beyond that, both respect and disrespect are, one, subjective because they're forms of value, and two, they can and should be earned, not automatic. So we can say that whether anybody does or doesn't respect you is going to be based in part on what you have done and how that aligns with what they do or don't value. That is an inherent part of how humans process the social world. You're never going to completely escape that. And trying to escape it by publicly or institutionally using power to force someone to outwardly respect you tends to breed private resentment. This is the classic question of freedom of conscience, that you can force someone to say that they agree with you, but that's tyrannical. They don't have to agree with you internally. You can't force them to agree with you. You could try to persuade them to agree with your position. But anything else is demanding obedience, not genuine agreement or genuine solidarity. And I've also observed that overall, every group of people, every society, culture, organization, family, whatever, has its own standards, attitudes, goals that it thinks are best, things that it wants to act on, its own agenda, if you will. And of course, so do individual people. But overall, it's not even slightly remarkable that any given group of people wants things to go its own way. and to want things to be as good as possible for its own purposes. Anyone can therefore rightly say that that group is only advocating for its own power and relevance, same as anyone else. There's nothing inherently noble or righteous about this in itself. And we might interpret it different ways depending on the context, but by itself, it's just a mundane fact that basically everybody is doing this all the time. So that gives us this dilemma. Because on the one hand, if we try to live up to non-autistic narratives, then we're always going to be playing catch up, because we on the spectrum, we're living in this world where these narratives were designed more or less without us in mind. We are trying to live up to standards that don't make sense for us. They're not constructive, realistic, whatever, from our perspectives, from our needs. And if we go the opposite direction and create narratives that are clearly suited entirely to our own preferences, then we risk this wish listing, that we're just saying all the things we would ideally like, rather than genuinely advocating in a more concrete or practical or whatever kind of way. And if we just say we want everything ideal for ourselves, well, other people then have good reason, like I was saying, to presume that we're just simply out for ourselves. And that's not necessarily true, but you can see how a cynical take on that would appear to be true from a lot of other people's perspectives, because there's nothing remarkable or noble about favoring one's own perspective or the perspective of one's own group. And so my position is that we need a third way. We need an intermediate path that considers factors and perspectives both inside and outside our own group. However we're defining our own group, that could mean different things. Even within the autism community, that can mean different things. And to create narratives that take a broader view of how groups interact and things that bring together shared or compatible values. So one way of doing this is to lean into existing values that work. I do a lot of this in my generic interacting with people out and about kind of thing, if it comes up that I'm on the spectrum. And this includes appealing to things that are broadly familiar to people in general: common sense, fairness, practicality, the utility of investing in people and getting a return on investment in a societal sense, the relatability of saying, wouldn't you want support if you were in this situation, once that situation has been explained and put into context, and the relatability of, hey, our interests, our preferences, our experiences are not fundamentally different from yours. They have direct parallels to yours. They're still human experiences that you can understand if you think about them for more than a moment. Yeah, the details differ, but the larger themes that apply to us don't really differ. Those are all human themes. And then the other dimension to this is to do what I call flexifying existing values that don't currently work, but maybe could. And there might be some values that just don't work. I'll acknowledge that too. But in any given society, there are a lot of values that are not bad in themselves, but have been turned into rigid demands rather than useful goals or guidelines. And American culture certainly has a lot of these, that they're taken as these intense demands, that it's good to be this way, let's encourage you to be this way, it's you have to be this way. And if you're not this way, you're not good enough. And if we can just shift that back to, this is good and will help encourage you in this direction and maybe help you get resources to get plugged into these kinds of goals, then a lot of beneficial things could result. But just being demanding and saying you're not good enough unless you just do this on your own is not helpful. And it's not just autistic people who are suffering from that. It's all kinds of other people. So for example, ambition and work, those aren't inherently bad values, but they're bad when they're turned into extreme, unsustainable expectations. Personal responsibility, again, a very useful value for a lot of reasons, but not when it blames the individual for systems that they didn't create and that they can't change on their own. And even therapeutic standards like mindfulness are not helpful if they're not contextualized and customized to the needs of the autistic individual. And not every autistic person is going to benefit equally or in the same way from these kinds of things. Some might not even benefit at all, potentially. So being able to take these standards and say, these aren't wrong, but they're wrong when they're taken to an extreme or when they're used in situations where they don't rightly apply. So that's the essence of my presentation and my current themes that I've been working on. So now I'm going to open it up to discussion.
Thank you, Scott. And I would encourage people to go ahead when you would like to be part of the discussion, have a comment, a question, clarification, input. Just unmute and I'll call on you. I get to start because I get to start. Scott, can you like paint us a little bit of a picture about what an autistic person feels or has to go through as they are dealing with the externalized shame that's being put on them that then forms that internalized shame? How does that happen?
Sure.
Can you describe that process?
Yep. So it's of course with all caveats, but it's going to look somewhat different for different people. But the most common pattern that I see is that you have an autistic person, whether they do or don't know they're on the spectrum yet. Some people aren't diagnosed until later adulthood, and so this kind of applies broadly. But one way or another, you have this autistic person who is struggling to meet a set of standards that have been set by society. The rules governing social interaction are not clear. They're unspoken. So it's difficult to navigate in a social sense. And where these various standards and demands have come from, like a good person does this and is that, well, where do those standards come from? That's not normally examined. That's at best, it's a superficial statement of it's good because it does good things, and it's not really very helpful description. So you have an individual on the spectrum who is usually growing up in a non-autistic family, in a largely non-autistic community, and doesn't have a lot of interaction with other autistic people, and almost certainly, usually at least, does not have autistic adults in their life to provide them with a sense of generational wisdom. How did previous generations of autistic people get through this? How do they think about it? So you've got this young person who is essentially inventing their own wheel or attempting to do so. There's no clear standard for doing so. There's no existing template. The existing templates that are present in their life are all ones that, or maybe not all, but many of them are ones that say, you're not good at this, you're not good enough, you can't connect with people, we don't want to be around you, you don't do all the things that we want and expect from you. And that leads to all kinds of frustrations, disappointments, about not having the friendships or the kinds of friendship that you want, not being able to keep up with executive functioning demands in a competitive sense, not being able to have the sense of, I'm going to be able to do what I want to do with my life, or other variations on these kinds of questions, some of which are very existential. Will I ever be liked by other people? Will I ever be loved? Will I ever have a legitimate role in society? What am I doing with my life if other people are just never going to provide these kinds of opportunities or connections to me? And there aren't clear answers to those things when you're a young person who isn't, your brain isn't mature yet, and you don't have access to better ways of thinking about this. And that then leads to a sense of despair and hopelessness, and usually an internalized sense of, well, everybody else does this fine. I'm the odd one out. Therefore, I must be the one who's broken. I'm the one who's not living up to the correct standard. Therefore, the problem is mine, which is more or less what we would say is the medical model of autism, that the problem is in the person, rather than in the system, or my preferred model, it's in the interaction between the person and the system, contextually. And when this has been going on throughout a person's formative years, and especially during the turbulent periods around middle school and the transition to adulthood, it's very easy, in the absence of positive or even neutral narratives, to develop a sense that everything is terrible, you're not good enough at anything you would like to do, other people are never really going to like you or connect with you, and if you are to have any hope at all, usually that's going to take the form of some kind of perfectionism, to say that the person has to drive themselves extremely hard in order to prove to others that they have some kind of social worth, that they're going to succeed at a career, for example, that will demonstrate that they really do have a valid contribution to make in society. But that perfectionism tends to be at the intense cost of time and energy and massive anxiety and other kinds of things that in the long run aren't sustainable. You might get through college or graduate school running on that kind of thing alone. But if you realize after that point that you're still not satisfied or that you're still struggling, then you're not going to be able to keep that up. And that's often when people then come to me, is in the middle of struggling in college or grad school, or when they are thinking about the fact that they haven't been able to, achieve some other kind of life goal. So that's the general pattern that I see in many of my clients and that I then target.
So again, please feel free to unmute. You can also put your questions in the chat, and I will be more than happy to relay them to Scott. So Scott, when you have autistic people that are struggling with being able to have that basic internal self-respect because they've just been told by society how they haven't lived up to society's standards, how do you help them like build that flame of dignity into then the fire? How and then are there ways that we can help people to regain their dignity and move past their internalized shame?
Yes. So some of the things that I do are, general counseling approaches that would apply to anybody who's dealing with shame issues. So some of those like known patterns and strategies do apply to autistic people. It's not fundamentally different in that regard. I use in my work 5 major models or approaches, and they're intended to flexibly deal with a wide range of issues, but they are rational emotive behavior therapy, narrative therapy, solution-focused approaches, existential approaches, and psychosocial education, which is not really a therapy model, but is just more like how do you understand other people, essentially. So in terms of how these apply to this internalized shame and dignity question, the rational emotive behavior therapy targets how are your thoughts impacting your emotions and how are your emotions impacting your thoughts. Because if you're only having negative thoughts about yourself, then you're going to feel these intensely negative emotions that are going to be draining. If you're feeling those negative emotions, then that is going to bias your thought process reciprocally, and then you're going to be stuck. I use the narrative approach to help reconstruct the person's narratives about themselves. If they're saying, I am broken, society is right, I'm not living up to those standards, then the narrative approach is to say, hold on, let's figure out what narratives work for you. If there are societal narratives that you happen to find to be effective and functional for you, great, you can use those. And the ones that don't, let's revise them or reject them and replace them with something else. And let's come up with a narrative that actually works for you, your values, your goals, once your values have been examined. The solution-focused component is mostly about in situations where you just have to do something and commit to it, what are you going to do and how? The existential component is usually more in the background for me, but it is this question of how are you defining purpose? What do you want out of life? How do you value your existence? And what are you going to do to spend your time on Earth? And the psychosocial education is putting the social tools in somebody's hands to say, okay, now you can actually better understand how to interact with and influence and persuade other people. So you have more of an ability to act on that. So you're not just intellectually understanding that you can or should have dignity. It's here's how you can really put that into practice and apply it in your life, removing obstacles to that on a social level.
Okay.
I am looking at the question in the chat. I think so the question is, what should someone expect that has a child with high functioning autism? I think, setting aside any terminological questions, that in general, what I'm talking about can be adapted to people of almost any age or developmental trajectory within the autism range. So I'm not sure exactly what is meant by expect, but I think, I mean, I would expect that many, not all, but many autistic children and adolescents would have either this negatively internalized sense of themselves, or something I didn't cover tonight, a negatively externalized sense of everybody else is at fault and it's never me. And that's a defense mechanism to say that whatever's being devalued about me is not something I'm going to allow to feel devalued about. But then that's not effective, because you're not taking any responsibility where it would be helpful to do that, and socially necessary to navigate situations by taking some accountability for yourself. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I do think this general question of helping any autistic child, to the extent appropriate for their particular needs, helping them understand that they are their own kind of person. They do not have to only think of themselves according to the standards of other people. That if they are being trained in or learning social standards and strategies, the purpose of that is not to be like other people. The purpose of that is not to be convenient for other people. The purpose of that is to use those strategies when you have reason to believe they will benefit you for your purposes, for your values, which you get to define for yourself. So that social strategies are tools to navigate the society that exists, rather than demands that insist you can only be good or acceptable in some measure if you engage in these behaviors or these beliefs or whatever and what have you. So if there's anything more to that question, if I didn't quite hit that on the head, I'd be happy to have follow-up as well.
I know you mentioned that this is sort of can be a lifelong, all ages can be affected by this. So can you just talk a little bit, if you can, about how, like with younger children, we can start to help them grow their sense of dignity, and then, how we might be able to intervene for young adults to help them recapture that sense of dignity?
So I think for young children, which is probably the ideal target range, to be able to give them lots of positive, and by positive, I don't only mean nice sounding, I also mean constructive and realistic, but positive messages about themselves, their abilities, their worth, that they are valued by family, by teachers, by so on and so forth. If they are being harassed, teased, etc., by other students, to identify what is going on, to try to put a stop to it if possible. And if it seems to be persistent, then to at least help the individual understand that, and I'm going to say this very bluntly, that is a flaw on the part of other children. What they're saying about you is not correct. They are being cruel. They're, having a mistaken understanding of you. They are whatever. And that's not your fault. They are not accurately describing you or your worth. They just, that's not right for them to do. That was a big protective factor in my case. As a kid, I did externalize. I was able to say that what other kids are doing to me is morally wrong, rather than absorb it as something like, oh yes, they have a point, which I never felt they did. I never believed that. Those kinds of things to help reinforce, and where possible, if you have or can identify anybody who seems like a role model of being different in a good way. Doesn't necessarily have to be only autistic, but anything that is different in a good way is potentially valuable. If you can find like a specific autistic role model, great. But to be able to show that child that, hey, these kinds of people might not always have it easy, or might not be, always liked by other people, but they're okay and they're good and they can do things that matter or that they like or whatever. To be able to illustrate that you're not just stuck in this dead end societal destiny of everybody's going to dislike you forever, or other variations on that idea. For adolescents and young adults who've already been through this, it takes more work, because you have to very actively look for what is the realistic and constructive approach. What is an approach to be able to say, you have these goals or these values, which you can keep growing and exploring and revising yourself. And if you do value that, if you feel a sense of you at least want to value your own life, then what does that look like? How do you craft a narrative that makes sense for you? understanding that every narrative is going to have its own limits and its own flaws, and there's no such thing as a single perfect narrative. So if some other narrative doesn't work for you, you can say, that's imperfect for me. I don't have to follow that. I can come up with one that is better, incremental improvement, or what have you. And one of the biggest difficulties usually is, will I ever be able to have meaningful relationships with other people? And that's a difficult one to answer for precisely the reasons that I talked about tonight. You can't force other people to like you, but the only way to pursue that goal is to keep learning and experimenting and trying and seeking out venues, opportunities, groups, topics, whatever, that give you some greater probability of being able to pursue these things. So let's put these tools in your hands as much as possible so that you have some ability to begin learning how to do these kinds of things, in the hope of being able to get these kinds of relationships, and to normalize the fact that relationships are not easy for anybody. Yes, they're especially difficult for autism spectrum purposes, at least in society in general, public at large, but it's not just you. You're not uniquely deficient in these kinds of things. Other people have similar difficulties. So I'm sure there's other things that could be said, but to give these believable narratives, not just like this fluff, believe in yourself, you can do anything you want, or whatever kind of things that offer no practical guidelines that can actually be acted upon.
Oh, and it also strikes me that it would be important, whether it's a family member or to have some sort of friends or even an online group that you can sort of talk with about when something doesn't work. They could say, hey, I tried this and it was a miserable failure. And they could say, wow, that was great that you tried that. What else could you try next?
Yeah.
Or what else are you going to try? Because I could just think of, in my personal life, the times that I have failed to connect with people, and how valuable it was that there was at least one person in my life who believed in me and who I trusted, so that I could continue to try again.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is enormously important, to have that hook or that anchor into, okay, somebody sees some kind of credible value, and has a narrative that can be expanded upon in that regard. And yeah, whether that's a clinical support group, a peer group, a more casual group of friends, something through like an Autism Society chapter, or whatever form it may take, even if there are no other autistic people around, just to be able to have some supportive adults who can ask that kind of question and give that kind of feedback is certainly better than nothing. So yes, being able to have some greater or lesser community, and a sense of, there is a place for me to address these issues, rather than I have to do all of this by myself, because nobody seems to have any credible idea of what I'm supposed to be doing and how to make this work for me.
We are nearing the end of, we usually try to slate these for 45 minutes. And so I would greatly love if anybody would feel free to unmute, ask any questions, comments. Does this make sense? Do you see this in the people that you know that are on the spectrum? Basically, does this resonate? Because I know in my working with people that this is definitely resonating with the people that I know, and the people that I care about and try to help with. Amanda?
I'm kind of like really trying to get information on this whole autism thing. I work as a peer support counselor with people with substance use and mental health. And I've been like experiencing lately, like some of these people that, are deemed like have a certain issue with mental health. Like I really truly believe that they are possibly on the autism spectrum, and somebody's just missing it somewhere. So I appreciate you guys for having these.
Thank you. And that goes to, we did just have, just so you know, Amanda, you can go back and watch one. We just had Lindsay McCary talk about the importance of diagnosis. And, I think that speaks a little bit to what you were saying. But Scott, how important is that identity to people?
It varies. Certainly, it's much more commonly seen as positive or essential than it was even 10 years ago. Like the number of people espousing that position is a lot bigger and a lot more open these days. But it does still depend on the person. That you're going to have some people who rarely don't accept that they're autistic at all, even if they have a good reason otherwise to believe that. You're going to have some who don't know but suspect and aren't sure what to think. You've got some who are recently diagnosed and not sure what to think. Maybe they haven't had any guidance on what that really means and that this is their first time being exposed to it. Or maybe they've been researching it for quite some time on their own. So they have some impressions of it, but they're still sort of navigating what it might mean. And then you've got others who've gone through various personal paths of, knowing and learning about it and formulating a different sense of what it means in their lives. The general consensus in the groups and venues that I'm plugged into is that there's nothing wrong with being autistic in itself, but it's also hard because of the social challenges, social pressures, and stigmas that we face. So there's nothing inherently flawed in us, although even there's some variation. Some people would tell you like maybe they're okay overall, but they still have some inherent flaws. Some might tell you that they do see autism as an inherent disability or even medical condition, and some of them accept that about themselves, and some of them really dislike it about themselves. So there's many different ways of perceiving these kinds of things in the individual, and I think that's important because you don't just want to push one narrative, however positive it sounds. You need to check in with the individual and customize and try to figure out what seems like it would be useful from them and their perspective, and should they revise and rethink what they're doing, or does this seem like a credible examined position on their part that maybe imposing another perspective wouldn't be the most helpful. So it's going to be complicated, but in general I push a narrative of you are okay in yourself. You can have flaws and limitations that you need to grow on, just like anybody, and we can accept that as a personal responsibility, while also saying that most of the difficulties that you're encountering are either caused by or exacerbated by societal standards that weren't designed with you in mind, aren't reasonable, they're carrying their own baggage, all that kind of stuff. And then let's go into detail about what that means in practice.
Well, thank you, Scott. I appreciate your time, your insight. I know how busy you are. I know from being on the board that you're being encouraged to do things with the board with Autism Acceptance Month. So I know there's a little added time commitment going on this month. So I really appreciate the time and your insight. Martha says very insightful and helpful, beginning the journey with the 21-year-old child in college, and it's also important. And foundational to I'm going to be with me longer than I'm going to be with anybody else. So I really want to work hard on building that first relationship with who am I in the universe. I really like the way.
And if I may, I'm going to give one quick plug. I am the co-founder and team leader for the Integral Adult Autism Conference, which is Wisconsin's first and technically only adult autism conference. So whether you are trying to support an adult on the spectrum, or you're thinking about where does your child's trajectory eventually lead, I encourage you to think about attending. It's coming up on November 4th of this year, which is a Saturday. And we have not completely finalized our subjects yet, but we do know that mental health will be one, and we are also looking at employment as being another. So we'll have 3 topics eventually, but we are still working on getting that hammered out. But yeah, integralautism.org. If you want to look at our website, and we hope to bring in our mission is to get autistic adults and then non-autistic parents and professionals in the same space, collaboratively talking about what is going on in autistic lives instead of being siloed. That's our overarching mission. So if that sounds interesting to you and you might like to participate, please do. We'd love to have you there.
Fantastic. And if you agreed to receive further communication from Southern Regional Center, we'll make sure that we have that as part of our resource roundup that we send out. And you can also be connected to the Autism Society of South Central Wisconsin. They do a good job of also promoting the Integral Conference. Very important conference. So thank you, Scott. Again, thank you everybody for taking time out of this beautiful day with beautiful weather, at least if you're in the Madison area. So really do appreciate your time and commitment to being here tonight. Thank you all very much. Hope you had a chance to do the short evaluation, bounce out that before you go. That would be fantastic. Again, thank you, Scott. Everybody have a good night.
Glad to be here. Thanks, everybody.